This morning I'm going to start with a true story that happened in the country of Malaysia in 2007, about 9 or so years ago. One night while ministering to the homeless on the streets of Kuala Lumpur, David Munn offered a boxed meal to a homeless man who seemed to refuse to talk to anyone. The man shooed David away as he shared the story of Jesus Christ with him. David calls the man Jeffrey in his telling of this story in order to protect his identity. Week after week, David returned to those same streets and returned to the same man, among others, ministering to them. But Jeffrey constantly was rejecting David. One day, David told Jeffrey about his own life and how he had turned his life around. He told Jeffrey that when he got out of prison, which he was in for drug trafficking charges, he asked Jeffrey if he was ever incarcerated, and Jeffrey said no, he was not. Jeffrey did perk up, though, when David talked about his drug past, and he told Jeffrey that he knew how to manufacture a certain narcotic. This perked up Jeffrey's attention, but David told Jeffrey that now that he is a follower of Jesus Christ, he no longer can do that. Well, Jeffrey admitted that yes, he frequently did drugs and that it was very difficult to stop doing drugs. But he still yearned for a normal life. The conversation that night ended with David giving Jeffrey a business card with his number on it, and that way he could contact him if he ever needed anything in the future. Turns out that time came about 2 months later. One night at about 10:30 at night, Jeffrey called David, and on the other end of the line, David heard Jeffrey's terrified voice. It turns out that Jeffrey had been robbed and beaten by several men in an alleyway, and Jeffrey was cowering behind a garbage bin. David got to the point with Jeffrey on the phone, and he said, "Jeffrey, are you serious about changing?" Jeffrey said, "Yes, I'm tired of this life." So Jeffrey changed into dry clothes, and David met him there, and David drove him to a nearby shelter. Jeffrey was admitted to the shelter, and David told him that he could stay as long as he needed there, as long as he followed the rules. Well, Jeffrey was there for about 7 months before being offered a job, and this was a pretty good job. It was a restaurant supervisor. Well, whenever it came time to accept the job, the twist came when Jeffrey refused the job opportunity. You might wonder why he did that. Well, what happened was Jeffrey actually came to his senses. And Jeffrey told David, "I don't want the job because I want to go home." He wrote down the address of a high-end residential area, and David drove Jeffrey to that address. And it was a huge house there that was guarded by a security guard. They parked and got out of the car, and you can imagine David's surprise when Jeffrey got down on both hands and both knees, and he crawled up the large staircase and rang the doorbell. A maid answered the door and allowed Jeffrey in. He crawled then across the long burgundy carpet that led from the door to the other end of a corridor where a man was sitting and was reading a newspaper. Jeffrey grabbed the man's leg, saying, "Papa, I am back." The startled man said, "Jeffrey, is that you?" He immediately threw down the newspaper and threw his arms around Jeffrey. Both of them cried, and shortly after, an older woman who turned out to be Jeffrey's mother came in the room when she heard the noise, and she cried with them. After the reunion settled down, Jeffrey went into another room to clean up, and Jeffrey's father told David that Jeffrey was his only son. And it turns out that Jeffrey was 18 years old and he rewarded his son with a new Toyota vehicle. And he rewarded him for his excellent studies at the end of high school. Only 4 days later, Jeffrey turned around and sold that Toyota for money to buy drugs. His father angrily kicked him out of the house and had not seen him literally in 20 years. Jeffrey's father then asked David, "How am I going to reward you?" David said, "My motive is to bring your son to you. I have no other intention. My reward is up there." And confused, his father looked at the ceiling, and David told him about his own struggle with drugs and his suffering on the streets that he had endured. The story shows how Jeffrey is one of many modern-day prodigal sons. He gave up luxury and wasted many years before coming to his senses and finally returning to his family. It is, of course, the parable known as the prodigal son, and that this morning is what we will look at. We'll find it in Luke chapter 15, beginning in verse 11 and going to the end of the chapter, which is verse 32. It is a longer passage, but it's a really good one. So this morning we will read it in its entirety, and the words are on the screen as always. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" Take a minute to let that sink in. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and to the hearing of His holy word. It is popularly called the parable of the prodigal son, But in keeping with the themes that of the stories Jesus was telling the Pharisees in Luke chapter 15, it is better to be referred to as the lost son, to complete the theme of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. For me, preaching on such a popular subject can be difficult because there's so much there. And how do I decide what to preach on in 20-25 minutes? Well, of course, it's Father's Day, so there is a father in the story. So that's the angle and the focus that I will take this morning. When we read this parable in a vacuum without the preceding two parables, you lose some of the significance that Jesus was pointing out when he was telling these two stories to the Pharisees. You see, the first parable was parable of the lost sheep, where the shepherd had 100 sheep and lost one. Then there's the parable of the woman with the lost coin, where the woman had 10 valuable coins and she lost one. And today we have a father with 2 sons, and he lost one. Well, the numerical progression is pretty obvious. We're going from 1 of 100 to 1 of 10, and now to 1 of 2. The lost percentage is increasing. But there's more to it than that. Also, the value of the lost through these 3 parables is increasing as well. To the shepherd, really, a sheep may be a dime a dozen. Sheep are more or less replaceable, so if he loses one, he'll get over it probably pretty soon. Then the coin that we talked about last week, that was lost. Now, that was worth a whole day's wage, so we're moving up in value much more than a sheep. But what value can you put on a person? What value can you put on your own son or daughter? I think of it like these MasterCard commercials that were popular just a few years back. They'd give you the cost of a ticket to a ball game, cost of popcorn and soda, cost of souvenirs, and then on the screen it'll say something like, spending time with your son, priceless. Remember those commercials? Well, those commercials pull at the heartstrings, and they drive home the truth that you cannot put a dollar value on spending time with family. There is no price that compassionate people will put on getting back a child who once was lost and was considered as good as dead, but is back now and is restored. We are compassionate people. I like to think most times, anyway, that applies to us. God designed us that way. God didn't create us to be robots, people who are devoid of character and personality and care. But in that same vein, God designed us with free will. God designed us with the ability to make decisions for ourselves, both good and bad. Now, one of the biggest charges I hear people make against Christianity is that people cannot understand why God would design people such as ourselves who can then turn around and reject their Maker and do such horribly terrible things. They say that God wouldn't allow that, and they're wrong. Like the son in the in the parable of the lost son, he made the choice to reject his father. And for all intents and purposes, through his actions, he told his father that he was as good as dead to him. Now, God allows people to make poor and even disastrous decisions because God respects the human will. The fact is that we serve a gracious Father in heaven. But have you ever thought that humanity never would have learned of God's graciousness unless He allowed us to make our own choices which result in transgressing His commands and then seek forgiveness? Now, don't get me wrong, God certainly hates it whenever we violate His law, and He hates it so much that sin requires the payment of blood. He hates it that much, but thanks be to God that He loves us so much that His Son shed His own blood to take our punishment for us. The fact is that God allows rebellion, and because He allows rebellion, this opens the door for creation to experience His grace if we do rebel. This is grace that we would not ever know of if we were robotic creatures without free will. The importance is knowing your Father in heaven in a deeper way. Graciousness is such an integral part of God's character. It is an aspect of Him that we would never experience if He had designed us differently. Now, the second point this morning is that God is long-suffering. Let me bring your attention to verse 20 in the parable, which says, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him." We lose a little bit of the cultural translation, if I can use that phrase, because we don't realize reading it here that in Judea there are very few vantage points that allow a person to see a long way off. So the question is, how is his father seeing a long way off? Well, this would require him to travel to a high peak. Most likely he did this day after day, maybe week after week. We're not sure how long he waited for his son. And he would have to travel to that peak to see if his son was returning. That is truly a labor of love, to go to this effort on such a continual basis as the father did. Just think of this man who misses his son so much. If he goes out in the morning and stands on his porch to see if his son's coming, he can't see very far, probably just see to the next neighbor's yard, and that's about it. So every day he packs up his necessities, maybe a lunch, something to eat, drink, whatever, and he sets out for that highest peak in hopes of spotting something, spotting anything that suggests that his son has finally come to his senses and his son is finally coming home. Day after day, week after week, he spent all this time looking for his son when he certainly could have been doing a host of other productive things. And don't forget that, maybe not in words, but certainly in deed, his son told him that he was as good as dead to him. His son showed him absolute and utter disrespect. Why in the world would anyone do what the father did? Why in the world would anyone eagerly anticipate a person like that coming home and coming back to you? It defies all logic unless you consider love. That is the only thing that makes sense, and therefore that is the only answer to it. It is this long-suffering love of the Father that was the difference. Sure, the Son made the effort to come back, but it was only due to the efforts of the Father and the Father alone that restored his Son. Look at the end of verse 19. It says, "Make me like one of your hired servants." That is what the Son, his intentions were. That is what he desired. But that's not where he ended up, is it? He ended up in a position that exceeded his expectations, all due to the graciousness of his Father. There's so much more to this parable that we literally have only scratched the surface, and we have plenty more to look at in the upcoming weeks. But for now, I want to return back to the story that we opened with, the story of Jeffrey and David. Jeffrey, who literally crawled back to his father after 20 years of doing drugs on the streets of Malaysia. And I would say that if the late, great Paul Harvey was here, he would probably say, "And now for the rest of the story." When we left off last, David left the reunited family, and about a year later, he received a call from Jeffrey's father. Jeffrey's father said, "David, I want to let you know that on the day you brought Jeffrey home, he was the only one going to church. But today, the whole family is going to church, and even our house help is coming with us. All of our idols are returned to where they belong. And today, I am telling you, David, my son is taking over my empire. He is sitting at my desk and at my chair to sign checks for me." Put this in biblical terms, I'd say the father got out the best robe and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Jeffrey was completely restored, and more so than before he initially left, in the same way that the Father restores the Son. And it is the same way that our Father in heaven welcomes us back into His family even when we don't deserve it. Today, if you've fallen away in a manner of speaking, maybe haven't completely given up, but maybe if your faith isn't quite where it should be, your Father in heaven will welcome you back. There are always things about our lives we know we should change. We are constantly being sanctified in that sense. It would be the best Father's Day present ever to give the present to your God and say, "Papa, I am back." He is waiting on all of His children to come back, and when you come back to Him, He does not scold you. He welcomes you with open arms, and He restores you to where you were always meant to be. All it takes is prayer and repentance and a commitment to honor your Father in that way. I'd like to close with a word specifically to our fathers here and men in general, because for any men here are not actually fathers. You may be more of a father to someone than someone who actually has a father. But what a blessing it is for us to have such a great example of Father's love to follow in Luke 15. We all know the state of the world that we live in, and good examples of a godly father are fewer and far between than they used to be. But we can always give thanks to God that He is the perfect example for us to follow. And my prayer is that our children and our grandchildren and our descendants and all those in our influence see the love of the Heavenly Father in our lives each and every day. Let us bow our heads and pray.